Morning, everybody, and thanks for watching. So, I talked about Judas and Pharaoh. Now, the next person now I'm going to talk about two people, and then a third after that, actually, um, that is not responsible for what they did, but will be held accountable for what they did. And the first one is a guy by the name of Caiaphas. And I don't know much about Caiaphas. I know that he was the high priest during Jesus' era, and he's the one who held the secret meeting at night that broke Jewish customs, broke Jewish rules to try Jesus and have him sent to the cross. They met in the cover of night without the whole council there, and that was illegal, from my understanding, according to the Jewish custom, the Jewish law. But Caiaphas did it anyway, and there's record of Caiaphas kind of leading the charge against Jesus. Um, and there's some research and thought out there that I've studied that to me points to the fact that Caiaphas knew exactly who Jesus was, and he was more um, inclined by satanic influence to get rid of the Son of God. But I can't really prove that, and I don't really want to get into that as well, um, based on the Talmud and all that stuff that came into being once the Pharisees started putting down their traditions of man in written form. But again, I don't want to go down that road. Let's just look at Caiaphas as being the leading Pharisee who instigated and organized all of this to try to push the people to crucify Jesus Christ. And Caiaphas was a great Pharisee. And what happened to Caiaphas, I don't really know. I don't really care. I'm not going to research it. Um, but I want to talk about God's responsibility in Caiaphas by actually talking about another great Pharisee. And since I don't know what happened to Caiaphas, I'm going to kind of focus in on this Pharisee. But before I do that, we must understand, just like Judas and just like Pharaoh, Caiaphas was under God's control. And no matter how evil and vindictive and secretive he was in bringing the end, the crucifixion to Jesus Christ, it was all under control of God. Remember, God planned from the very beginning for Jesus Christ to die on the cross, to be entombed and be resurrected for all humanity. So Caiaphas played his role in this, and he will be held accountable for what he has done. And through that account, Caiaphas' actions will bring glory to God that we could not have seen if Caiaphas didn't do what he did. Glory and joy will be brought to us because of what Caiaphas did. And not only that, but Caiaphas, through what he did, will learn and come to a greater character. So he, in the end, even though he was a vessel of dishonor, will come to a place of joy, will come to be filled with all that God is when God becomes all in all. And even Caiaphas will have a joy that is unthinkable. And that joy is completely based on what he did in this life, the evil that he performed, and how God works through that, and how Jesus transmutes all sin to righteous acts when it's all said and done. Even Caiaphas will have that joy and understanding and appreciation of God based on the specific things that God made him walk through and that God made him do. And that's how it works with all of us. But you can compare Caiaphas and God's responsibility by comparing him to another Pharisee who is referred to as the chief Pharisee, I believe, the Pharisee of Pharisees. And that was a guy by the name of Saul of Taursus. So you have Caiaphas, who was the high priest, a great Pharisee. And in the same mannerisms, the same type of person was a guy by the name of Saul of Tarsus. And I'm talking about Saul of Tarsus because we know what happened to him. And what happened to Saul of Tarsus, who was the Pharisee of the Pharisees, who believed the same thing Caiaphas did, was actually working for Caiaphas. Saul of Tarsus was. We can see God's purpose. Because if we can relate Saul of Tarsus to being a great Pharisee, then if God can do something with Saul of Tarsus, he could have done something with Caiaphas. God didn't choose to do anything with Caiaphas. He chose him to remain as chief priest and go through what he went through to crucify Jesus. But God chose something else with this Saul of Tarsus. Remember, Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He had the same mindset of Caiaphas. So if God can change the mindset of Saul of Tarsus, then he could have changed the mindset of Caiaphas. But God chose not to change the mindset of Caiaphas, but he chose to change the mindset of Saul of Tarsus. So ultimately, it's God's responsibility in that choice. And Caiaphas had to walk in what God had predestined him to walk in. And Saul of Tarsus had to do the same. So what happened to Saul of Tarsus? Well, we know what happened to Saul of Tarsus. He was changed. He was knocked off his horse. He was visited by the glorified, resurrected Jesus Christ and changed into something else. That's who we know became the Apostle Paul. Now, Jesus said to the Apostle Paul, well, when he was Saul of Tarsus, when he got knocked off his horse, when Saul of Tarsus was going to do Caiaphas's and every other Pharisee's bidding by leaving Jerusalem, finding people who believed in Jesus Christ everywhere, dragging them out of their houses at night and murdering them. I mean, that's even worse than Caiaphas, wouldn't you say? Or at least on the same line. That's what Saul of Tarsus was doing when he met Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. And what did Jesus Christ say to him? He said a few things, I am Jesus, the one you're persecuting. But he said, nevertheless, he said to rise to Saul of Tarsus after he knocked him off his horse. Jesus says to him, nevertheless, rise and enter the city, and it will be spoken to you what you must be doing. He didn't give Saul of Tarsus a choice. Oh, now you see the resurrected Christ. Now, okay, are you going to change your mind? Let me sit back and wait after I perform this great act of making myself visible, a light brighter than the noonday sun, and I knock you off your horse and blind you. Now go, think about this for a while and make a decision. Well, he did go and think about it, but the decision was never up to him. It was always God's responsibility. Again, in Acts chapter 9, verse 6, Jesus says, nevertheless, rise and enter the city, and it will be spoken to you what you must be doing. It's not Saul's responsibility. He will walk through a lot of things, and we know when Saul changes to Paul, he went through a lot. He must do a lot, and he must suffer a lot. But that's all of God. God said, Jesus Christ said, you must be doing this. Later, the Lord talks to Ananias, and he says to him, yet the Lord said to him, talking about Paul, this is verse 15 and 16 of chapter 9, yet the Lord said to him, go, for he, talking about Paul, is a choice instrument of mine to bear my name before both the nations and kings. Okay? And Ananias was saying, wait, you're talking about this Saul of Tarsus guy? This guy's going around murdering and putting believers in Jesus Christ in jail. Well, the Lord said to him these very words to comfort Ananias and tell him what he was doing now with Saul of Tarsus, who would become Paul. So it was all God's decision. And God chose to do this with Saul of Tarsus, the greatest of all sinners, as a display of his grace, as a display of how God is now going to operate with the nations, and that it's not up to people following rules or being part of law. It's up to God's choice, His grace alone. So that's why He chose the greatest sinner, just like Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the one instigating, driving everybody to call out and want to murder Jesus. Well, Paul was a step above Caiaphas. Saul of Taursus was a step above Caiaphas in regards to evil. Because God chose the one who was exacting the greatest evil on Jesus Christ's name to choose him to be a vessel. He could have done it with Caiaphas, but he waited for an even more evil sinner, and that was Saul of Tarsus. So it was God's responsibility to leave Caiaphas to do what he did, but to intervene and have Jesus Christ, the glorified Jesus Christ, choose and change Saul of Tarsus to the Apostle Paul. So ultimately, it is all of God. And it's his responsibility to do what he did with Saul of Tarsus and making him Paul, the apostle to the nations, just as it's his responsibility to leave Caiaphas to do exactly what God had planned him to do. So he carries out his role as a vessel of dishonor. And the Apostle Paul, that's God's responsibility. And the Apostle Paul, whose name was later changed from Saul of Tarsus, he was also a vessel of honor. I believe someone made a comment, I think it was Frank Hill, maybe it was someone else, that something to the extent that if God can change the vessel of dishonor, Saul of Tarsus, into Paul, our apostle, then he can do the same to all humanity and every creature. And that's exactly what he does. Because Paul, when he was previously Saul of Tarsus, was a vessel of dishonor. And God took the responsibility to change him based on his will to do something else. And it's God's responsibility to change people or to leave them according to his plan. So whatever his plan is, to change or just have people carry out as a vessel of dishonor their entire lives, that's all up to God. And if in this instance, in Saul of Tarsus' life, God changed this vessel of dishonor to a vessel of honor. But even if he doesn't do it in this life, God has the power to change every vessel of dishonor, like Judas, like Pharaoh, like Caiaphas. And the fourth person I was going to talk about was all of us. Whether we're a vessel of dishonor outside the body or whatever we do, whether we're a vessel of honor. Everything we do, every sin we commit, every decision we make is all God's responsibility that he will hold us accountable for in order to, at some point, if he hasn't already, will change everyone from a vessel of dishonor to a vessel of honor, because we'll all be vivified, we'll all be perfected, we'll all be made immortal and have an enjoyment that we couldn't possibly have had, an appreciation that couldn't come to its fullness if we didn't go through the decisions we made in this life. And it's applied in the same way to Judas, to Pharaoh, to Caiaphas, and to Saul of Tarsus. And in the end, at the flip of a switch, God can overcome everything and transmute everything that we have done into a righteous act, so that God will be all in all, like 1 Corinthians 15:28 says. And I wanted to get into A.E. Knox's book, Problem of Evil, the last chapter there, the appreciation of God, but I'm running low on time, so I'm going to get to that next week or at the next video. Thank you. Have a good day.